We're speaking with Ambassador Dunford about your new book called Talking to Strangers. So just wanted to start by asking you about the title, because it's a very interesting title.
Well, the story is, which you find just before I went off to Kuwait on my way to Iraq, I talked to my son, and my granddaughter got on the phone. She was 4 years old. And she said, "Are you going somewhere where it's dangerous, Grandpa?" I said, "Well, you know, maybe a little dangerous, but, you know, I'll be okay." She said, very seriously, "Don't talk to strangers." And I smiled, and it became kind of an image for me. I was going to talk to Iraqis, and of course I had to talk to strangers. But also, I talked to a lot of American strangers, too. I talked to the American military and served in the military, so it was a cultural divide that we had to overcome.
Yeah.
And also the ideological people there who were, we call them neocons, but talking to them sometimes was like talking to strangers.
Yeah, I really love that title. I think that's such a good summary kind of you know, the experience. And speaking of which, so what was your role in the rebuilding process?
Well, they initially contacted me and said that I would be in charge of the economic ministry, because I've been an economic officer in my career. And then, of course, I almost had no role at all when Don Rumsfeld, then Secretary of Defense, decided the people nominated were too low profile and bureaucratic. And then I lucked out. I got the foreign ministry because the individual who had been chosen to work in the foreign ministry couldn't go for medical reasons. So I ended up with the task of trying to get the foreign ministry back up and running.
Great. And so speaking of that, because you talked about a number of kind of the challenges and, you know, computers in hallways and kind of finding space wherever you could. And it kind of speaks to the broader question of, do you think that things were kind of done in a proper order? Or do you think that things should have been rebuilt in a different way, like maybe focusing on one or two ministries and getting them running? Or do you think that kind of the broad scale approach was the only option?
Yeah, well, there are a lot of tricky questions in there. First of all, I would say it was so chaotic because no real planning was done for the post-combat phase. And actually the Department of State did a year's worth of planning, but the Department of Defense was in charge and they pretty much ignored it. Then, as far as order goes, we needed, I think, we were in a race against time. We needed to get the Iraqis back to work, and then we could worry about how democratic and how free enterprise the society would become. But instead, we started trying to remake a kind of democratic capitalist paradise in Iraq long before we had the basic groundwork laid.
Okay, and so your feeling was that it was really important to rebuild a lot of these institutions before we kind of focused on other things. And
yes.
Do you think that was an obstacle to success?
Well, the huge obstacle was, of course, the looting, which destroyed virtually every ministry except the Ministry of Oil. And that meant I had to start from scratch, really. The foreign ministry was abandoned, and it was looted and burned, and papers all over the place, and no plumbing, no electricity. So we really had to start right at the beginning, and that was a huge obstacle to getting things going.
In thinking about the rebuilding, and you talk about this quite a bit, and in fact your co-author was sort of your Iraqi counterpart in rebuilding this. You know, what were some of the struggles with reintegrating Iraqis back into, you know, their foreign ministry, and what were some of the challenges that you kind of faced in bringing them back into the picture? Well,
the one struggle, of course, is finding a place for them to sit and you know, getting the air conditioning running and the plumbing running. But the other struggle was, of course, the Iraqi foreign ministry had a lot of Baathists, and when Jerry Bremer came and took over what became the Coalition Provisional Authority, he essentially fired the top levels of Baathists. So we had to find people who understood how the foreign ministry worked, but yet were not in the high levels of the Ba'ath Party, and that was very tricky.
And you know, one thing I wanted to ask you about, and you do this in the book as well, but you highlight a few of the Iraqis that, I mean, you really talked about how they kind of embodied this spirit of wanting to rebuild the country, and I think that's a a challenge to kind of the notion a lot of people have that Iraqis were not invested in rebuilding. And I was wondering if you would maybe just give us a highlight of one of the people that you worked with.
Sure. Well, my co-author was certainly, I would start with him because he took the initiative really to organize the steering committee and to really come and meet the Americans and to get things rolling. And then I'd also highlight Aqila al-Hashimi, who was the only woman on the steering committee, who turned out to be an organizational genius. She managed to get the UN to provide us furniture, and she really helped us make progress fast. And it's one of my great regrets because she got assassinated later in the year, later in 2003. And because I had helped her get such a high profile, I just feel like I put a target on her back.
You know, it's a really interesting point because as we're watching, you know, the violence kind of spread and continue, there are lots of links between kind of maybe, you know, ways that rebuilding was done. And I'm just wondering if do you see any connections between kind of the CPA and its policies and some of the violence that we see today? Do you think that there might have been a way to prevent it? Because the story you just told really clearly demonstrates that even in the rebuilding process, this violence was a really big problem and a real challenge to even maybe the best laid policies and plans.
Yeah, well, the mistakes were made long before the CPA was created or long before Jerry Bremer came. That's not to say he didn't make some mistakes too, deep athification, firing the military, and trying to make it a kind of free market paradise. But before that, well, the mistake to invade Iraq in the first place, well, I won't go there. But then not enough troops to prevent the looting, and then communications was a huge problem. The Kuwaitis had offered to build, to extend their cell phone network up through Baghdad, which would have allowed everybody to communicate with each other. It would have made the whole political process so much easier. But the Pentagon determined they were going to reserve the business for MCI WorldCom, which never really came and never really got it done.
Yeah, I find I'm curious to know your thoughts on maybe what would have been a better way to rebuild kind of the economic structure. Do you think it would have been best to try and really keep it local, keep it regional, or, you know, what do you think was sort of the best way to approach that?
Well, I think, first of all, get everybody back to work, as Iraq was. And then when you have a working government, you have working ministries, you have working state-owned industries. Now, obviously, ideologically, state-owned industries weren't looked on with great favor, but they did employ people and they kept people off the streets. And then you can worry about economic policies, which would privatize ongoing state-owned industries, and you could expand Iraq's trade with other countries, and, you know, working slowly. But the first thing to do is get everybody back to work.
Yeah. Sort of in closing, what would you say was sort of a takeaway thought, or kind of a summary, or any sort of just kind of lasting impression you had from the time that you spent in Iraq working to help rebuild it?
Well, I didn't really answer a question you asked earlier, which is how invested were the Iraqis in rebuilding their country. And the answer was the ones I worked with were very invested in it. And they thought of themselves as Iraqis. They were patriots. They didn't think of themselves as Sunni or Shia or Kurd first. They thought of themselves as Iraqis. And I think we made some bad mistakes, in addition to the ones I've discussed, by trying to organize the government so it would be absolutely fair, in accordance with the population distribution, 60% Sunni, 20%, 60% Shia, 20% Sunni, 20% Kurd. And we set up the first governing council proportionally that way. And fairly quickly, that plus looting, which makes everybody sort of fall back on their own ethnic groups. Those two things, I think, really contributed to, well, what became the Civil War.
And so, I mean, is there kind of an impression, I don't know, was there anything that sort of was challenged for you? Maybe an impression you had of Iraq that after spending time there, you know, you kind of saw it differently?
Well, yes, I hadn't been to Iraq before, and I had a chance to go up to Mosul and see the Nineveh, Nimrud, and the antiquities there, what was left of them, I might add, and come down by helicopter through the Tigris Valley, which was it's a beautiful country and has oil. So I see in the long-term future, I see good things for Iraq, and it's kind of tragic in the short term. What last 10 years have been almost wasted, not quite, but I wish them well.
Yeah. Just one final question. What role do you think the U.S. should play going forward in Iraqi policy?
Well, we have a big presence there. We have probably the largest embassy in the world, and we are training the Iraqi military. We have to be careful, though, that we aren't intervening in what could be, again, a resumption of the civil war. I mean, we're seeing a lot of violence now. The Sunnis really haven't been given an opportunity to reintegrate into the political process. There's a lot of tension between the Shia government and the Kurdish government. So we have to be really careful, I think, as how we operate with the Iraqis. We don't want to be seen as helping one side or the other side. We want to be seen as helping Iraq get back on its feet.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for your time today. I really enjoyed reading the book, and I'm recommending it to everyone to read it.
Thank you so much.
It's an excellent book. So thank you so much for writing it, and thank you for your time.
Oh, thank you for letting me talk about it.